Good morning, it's Loren Lockman from the Tanglewood Wellness Center, and I've been asked this morning to talk a little bit about energy while fasting. And many people fasting find, what's typical in fact, while there's a whole range of symptoms that people can experience, most people actually feel okay most of the time, except that their energy is lower, right? They feel tired and weak, basically. How tired and how weak somebody feels depends on various factors. And we've discussed this a little bit, but basically, toxicity of the body. So depending on the toxicity of the body and the nature of that toxicity, as the body is breaking down fat, dumping those toxins into the bloodstream, certain kinds of things are going to affect how we feel. And you're going to feel very weak and tired depending on the nature of what's being dumped in the bloodstream. Typically, the more toxic, the more tired and weak, to an extent. But there are other mitigating factors, okay? A couple of examples, a couple specific conditions where someone's got candida, for instance, systemic candida problem, which is common today and something we've seen probably hundreds of times here over the last 19 years now. As those yeasts are dying off because they're starving, they're not getting fed when you're fasting, they starve off, they're in the bloodstream, you got all these dead critters in your bloodstream. You typically feel really toxic and very, very tired and weak. The same thing is true for people with Lyme disease. Okay? As the Lyme is dying off, people typically feel very weak and very tired. That's really common. With other conditions, it's less dependent on the condition in many cases. So it's not necessarily true that people with hypertension are going to feel more or less tired. It depends on the person, because it depends on what else is going on for them. So toxicity is a factor. Specific conditions can create that. But the other thing that we've talked a little bit about is body composition itself. Typically, because one of the reasons that people feel tired is the body is actually sending a message that says, don't move. Now, why would your body not want you to move at all? When might this be an issue? To save energy. So for instance, if someone has got, in fact, the original question, if someone has down to 2% body fat, will they be weak? Yeah, right? I mean, 2% body fat is essential fat. That's what we need to survive. So if someone approaches 2%, the body's going to send an increasingly stronger message saying, don't move, don't waste any energy, don't do anything you don't have to do. This is a way of saving energy so we don't get too low, okay? So this is one of the things that's going to happen. And so the opposite of that, the corollary, we see people sometimes who are obese, and I've actually had people who have been 300 or more pounds more than they should have been. And those people typically don't get tired or weak at all. They feel perfectly energetic the entire time, even though they might be quite toxic. Now, that relates to the next question, which I'll come to. Hang on. Oh, no, it relates to a question, that relates to a question we covered recently, just a couple days ago. You asked me if people who were leaner were less toxic than people who were heavier. And if you recall, my answer was no. One thing has nothing to do with the other. However, what's true is someone who is much heavier might have the toxins in their body much more sparsely distributed. So with every pound of body fat, there's less toxins being dumped into the bloodstream. Okay? So it could be that even someone who's quite obese, morbidly obese, and fairly toxic, as their body's breaking down fat, they're dumping less into their bloodstream than someone who's very lean, who even could be less toxic, okay? Just because it's all relative. So those are the basic factors that are going to determine, most of the time, what someone's energy level looks like. And it's funny because some of you, many of you here, have been quite weak over these last couple of weeks. And that might feel very challenging to you in many ways. Honestly, in some ways, I think it's actually an advantage. Imagine the person who's got plenty of energy, and they're fasting, and they know they should be resting, but they feel energetic. And it's much harder for them to sit still. Okay? For some of you guys, you don't really have too many options right now. You're pretty much going to be resting because you can't do much else. Right? In a way, it's an advantage. It actually makes it easier to do what you need to do. Okay? Now, by the way, how tired you are now does not necessarily reflect how long it will take you to bounce back or how you'll feel after you start eating. Sometimes people rebound really, really quickly, surprisingly fast. So there isn't necessarily a direct correlation. There may be some correlation. Typically, the weaker somebody is, the longer it's going to take them. But it's not a direct correlation. It's not one-to-one. In some cases, people feel amazingly great very quickly. And I've mentioned her before, but I had a client once who fasted with me for just about 2 weeks. And during her fast, and she was also very lean, like you guys are, during her fast, she could barely move. She was so wiped out, she was basically laid in bed and did almost nothing else. Then she broke her fast. And after her second meal, she was walking around like she had never fasted. Her energy was incredibly high and it never went down again. I mean, for the rest of that stay with me, she's fasted with me a couple times, but for the rest of that stay, that was her first fast, her energy never flagged. So it wasn't a temporary effect. It was something that she maintained for the next 4 or 5 days until she left. Okay? So sometimes it's surprising how quickly we rebound. All right. Any other questions about energy levels in fasting? No? All right. Well, I hope that's been helpful to you. I'll see you next time.